Já, ég bara byrja þetta. Góðan daginn og velkomin á þennan félagsfundur Afþreyingarnefndar SAF undir heitinu Öryggismál í ævintýraferðaþjónustu. Ég heiti Ágúst Bjarnason og er verkefnastjóri Afþreyingarnefndarinnar og samtaka ferðaþjónustunnar. En ástæða þess að við boðum til þessar fundar byggir kannski fyrst og fremst á umræðu í kjölfar slyss á Breiðamerkurjökli í fyrra, 25. ágúst. En eftir slysið fór á stað umræður öryggismál í ævintýraferðaþjónustu á Íslandi, hvað mætti og hvað ætti mögulega að gera og allir virtust hafa skoðun á því. Ýmislegt breyttist strax, vatnajökulsþjóðgarður meðal annars endurmat samninga við rekstraraðila og bætti inn ákvæðum skipan fagráðs og reglulegs eftirlits eða mat og jók kröfur fyrir yfirleiðsögumenn. Og svo hafa ýmsir aðrir aðilar þar á meðal starfshópar á vegum ríkisins unnið að tillögum sem miða að því að efla öryggismál og öryggismenningu í afþreyingu. Ýmist í gegnum þá menntun, regluverk og annað slíkt. Og það er alveg átt að segja það að það liggja fyrir drög að uppfærslu á regluverki öryggisáætlanir í ferðaþjónustu. En það er ekki búið að leggja það fyrir ráðuneyti og ekki búið að leggja það fyrir Alþingi. Þannig að það er alveg verið að vinna á ýmsum hliðum, eða frá ýmsum hliðum. Öryggismálin hafa líka orðið að umræðefni fjölmiðla, samfélagsmiðla og sunnudags vöfflukaffi hjá og afa. En það virðast allir hafa skoðun á þessu. Og ég þurfti meira að taka umræðan í miðju nutti daginn. Þessi nuttarinn virtist hafa áhuga á þessu. En eins og gefur að skilja í kjölfar svona slyss sem var mjög áberandi í fjölmiðla umfjöllun, að þá snýst umræðan svolítið eða hefur snúist svolítið ísjalla og jöklaferðir. En ætti með réttu að snúast ævintýra eða Afþreyingarferðaþjónustu í heild sinni. Ævintýraferðaþjónusta er náttúrulega mjög svona vítt hugtak og hluti ferða sem í boði þar eða hluti framboðs starfar undir mjög svona skilvirku eða þéttu regluverki sem stundum of þétt. En annar hlutinn, svo sem jöklaferðir, rafting og fleira, er kannski ekki í miklu regluverki fyrir utan að það er svona eitthvað einstaka eftirlit ef þau eru til staðar. Þannig að við ætlum svolítið að fókusera á þann hluta í dag, þann hluta sem er ekki inn í regluverkinu. Ástæðan fyrir því að þar liggja kannski mestu tækifærin í að efla öryggi og öryggismenningu. Og svona við eigum í raun aldrei að vera hræddir við að taka þessu umræðu. Við eigum aldrei að gefa afslátt á öryggi. Þannig að við þurfum alltaf að taka þessu umræðu þegar hún kemur upp. Og það er mikilvægt fyrir okkur, eða ykkur réttara sagt, sem komið frá rekstraraðilum, að leiða umræðuna og leiða skrefin sem að verður farið í. Frekar en að við fáum á okkur einhvern bunka regluverki og hvað það nú er. En nú á tuðinu mér, ég ætla bara að sveissa yfir á ensku. Jeff. We are pleased to begin today's meeting with a presentation from Jeff Byerline. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, but you will probably say it yourself. He's an executive director of Víristar, an international consultancy specializing in safety, quality, and professionalism in adventure tourism. Jeff has extensive global experience in outdoor safety and adventure management, adventure tourism management. He worked here in Iceland as a teacher at Keilir at one point, when Keilir still had their studies in adventure tourism guide. He also knows Iceland quite well through that education. So he's been here a couple of times. He knows a lot of the companies, and he knows a lot of people here. Through his presentations, if you have any questions, just raise your hand, and I'll try to stop him, and we'll ask questions along the way to get a better communication going and so on. So Jeff, welcome. Over to you.
Takk fyrir and guten daginn, everyone. It's nice to speak with you today. I will share my screen here so we can all see the presentation. Could I get a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm glad to be speaking with you today about the role of regulation in strengthening the adventure tourism sector in Iceland in particular. And we will look at how a variety of countries around the world have addressed quality and safety in outdoor adventure experiences through regulatory systems, and we'll talk about what a quality regulatory system would look like and what a quality process of developing those regulations would look like as well. So that's what's on the schedule here today. And I want to start out just by saying that there's a lot of things that are going very well in adventure travel and adventure tourism in Iceland. The World Economic Forum's Travel and Tourism Competitiveness report from 6 years ago said that Iceland is number 2 in safety worldwide, and just last year they said Iceland's number 1 out of European and Eurasian economies for safety and security with travel and tourism. And they looked at 17 different factors when evaluating Iceland, and they said that safety is the very top one. That Iceland is doing very, very well in safety. Price competitiveness was on the other end of the spectrum. Also, the Adventure Tourism Development Index report put Iceland in the top 10 percentile of countries and territories for safety. So there's a lot to celebrate about what's going well with Iceland and adventure tourism and adventure travel and safety. But as we know, the recent incident on Breiðamerkurjökull in Vatnajökull National Park invites us to ask, is there more that can be done? Let's take a moment to look at the current situation in Iceland with respect to safety in adventures. We'll talk about a few different pieces, including Ferðamálastofa and Vatkin. So, as you all know, to be a tour operator in Iceland, one has to have a Ferðamálastofa license, and Ferðamálastofa asks every operator, requires them to have a safety plan with 4 different pieces. These plans are not submitted, but Ferðamálastofa can ask for them, and if they're clearly inadequate, then the tourist board can levy daily fines. In addition, depending on the activities and the situation, there are other licenses which may have safety components that are required of tourism operators. In Vatnajökull National Park, there's been a long-standing permit process that was historically trust-based. These days, things have been tightened up, particularly for ice cave tours. There are restrictions, and it's no longer permitted to do those in the summer. And there are requirements to follow the recommendations of Vatkin and the Icelandic Tourist Board. Vatkin itself has, in my view, a very well-developed system of good practice procedures that it recommends for adventure tourism operators. There's 30 different sets of criteria-specific good practice recommendations, and there's an extensive safety plan that goes along with this. And importantly, there's a third-party audit that occurs as part of the Vatkin Award, where another organization comes in and says, yes, you're actually doing what it says on paper that you are doing. This is a voluntary system, however, so not everybody gets certified with Vatkin. Ferðamálastofa, a dozen years ago, also published a series of safety recommendations that have to do with the 4 elements of the safety plan, and talk in detail about guide competencies and guide certification and training. This has never been converted into a regulatory requirement, as you know. So the current situation can be characterized by a number of good recommendations and systems. They are voluntary, and most of the time there is no third-party audit to make sure that what is said is being done is actually being done. And the focus tends to be on 4 elements of a safety plan: risk assessment procedures, an incident response plan, and an incident reporting system, along with a focus on leader qualifications. Let's now head to a place that's clearly not Iceland and look at how other organizations, other countries around the world have regulated adventure safety. There are about 8 countries globally that have adventure safety regulations or a law in effect, and there are perhaps 4 others that are working on the regulations and the regulatory development process but have not completed things quite yet. We'll start with New Zealand, where in 2008, a group of teenage students from Elam Christian College were on a hike in a gorge led by a guide from an adventure center. The gorge flooded and 6 children and their school teacher drowned. A couple weeks later, a 21-year-old British tourist drowned during a riverboarding incident, and there was a lot of pressure on the government to change how things operated. So the government put in adventure safety regulations. They required every operator to have a comprehensive safety management system or a structure for managing risk. And there was a third-party audit for that, very similar to what Vatkin has. And there's a number of criteria that are required to be part of that safety management system. In fact, the requirements in New Zealand are quite comprehensive and very high quality, and are probably a global exemplar for other companies and other regulatory bodies to follow for those who are interested in regulating adventure safety. For example, the requirements say that there must be a positive safety culture as exemplified by a commitment from the top leadership of the operator, the adventure tourism operator, to safety. There's the use of the hierarchy of controls, which is compulsory, where you eliminate risks and then you minimize risks through other control measures. Risks have to be managed throughout the activity, and there's a strong commitment to a continual improvement process as well. Let's move over to Switzerland, where in 1999, 52 tourists were going through a canyon with several guides, and a flash flood came through the canyon. 18 tourists and 3 of their trip leaders drowned. Just 10 months later, that same company that had that major incident was operating a bungee jump tour off of a gondola that goes over a valley in Switzerland, and they have 2 places where the gondola stops, and there's 100 meters drop down to the ground in one, and there's about a 200-meter drop, and they have a short rope for the first drop and a long rope for the second drop. So they got to the short drop and they attached by mistake the long rope, almost 200 meters, to somebody, and the person bungee jumped and did not survive the fall. That company went out of business. There were calls for safety regulation. People were saying, yeah, folks are a little careless here. We need to do something about it. And the government in Switzerland said, no, thank you. We think it's the role of business to regulate yourselves. We're not interested. But there kept being pressure, but the government just didn't, but wanted the businesses to regulate themselves. So the private sector came together and created a voluntary plan called Safety in Adventures. But because it was voluntary, like Vatkin, very few people signed up, and it was ineffective, and it was eventually scrapped. And the government finally, years later, put into place an adventure safety law and regulation saying that companies have to be licensed and that guides have to be qualified, and there's an annual third-party audit as well. Now moving to the United Kingdom, in 1993, a group of young children were going out on what was to be a 2-hour paddle on the south coast of England in Lyme Bay, pictured here. The group was going out with instructors from an adventure center who were not experienced and well qualified, didn't have safety equipment with them, like a VHF radio. The wind came up, the waves were 1 meter high, kayaks started capsizing, the kayaks were blown out to sea, and 4 children drowned. There was a lot of pressure on the government to act at that point, and so the government passed a law and adventure safety regulations saying that operators have to be licensed before they can engage in adventure activities, certain adventure activities. Then there's a number of requirements, like there has to be a sufficient number of competent staff and adequate equipment and so on. And there is a third-party audit like Vatkin has. Let's move now to the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. Many governments in the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East are working to diversify their economies away from oil and gas, and the UAE is part of that. There have been a number of safety incidents and calls for regulation in the UAE. And in Fujairah, which is one of the emirates in the United Arab Emirates, the government has really invested in adventure tourism and adventure safety. They built this whole adventure center that you can see pictured here, that there's a tower in the background with a climbing wall. From where this picture was taken, there's a zip line that goes across the lake and then crosses back to the lake and ends near that tower. They put in, the government put in a permit system and created some safety regulations. And they've also brought in outside specialists from around the world to provide trainings and guidance on safety in adventure activities. In addition to the UAE creating adventure safety regulations for the tourism sector, Oman has created a very comprehensive, high-quality regulatory structure with a third-party audit, and Saudi Arabia is working on things as well. Dubai has regulations, particularly for challenge courses and climbing walls and the like. Coming back to Europe, in the Eastern European nation of Georgia, there were a number of unfortunate safety incidents in the adventure sector. A couple years ago, a paraglider crashed into a cliff that you see pictured here and was significantly injured. A rescue helicopter with 8 rescuers came in, the tail rotor hit the cliff, and the helicopter fell, and all the rescuers died. There was a national day of mourning, and the adventure tourism private sector said, we need regulation. We need the government to step in and require better safety measures. And Veerstar was contacted to support that, and so I went to Georgia a couple years ago and met with government officials and met with the private sector and drafted regulations for Parliament in the Republic of Georgia to adopt. The regulations that were written were based primarily off of the New Zealand system, where there's a safety audit standard and a third-party audit to help make sure that the regulations are actually, or the safety standards are actually met. In Japan, Japan is known as a very attractive travel and tourism destination globally. There's a lot of wonderful opportunities for outdoor adventure. There's also a history of some safety incidents. For example, an avalanche that killed 7 students and a teacher on a mountain training experience several years ago. And the private sector has really been pushing for adventure tourism safety regulations. The government is not so interested, however, but the private sector is continuing to advocate, and they invited me to come over and meet with regulators and talk about how the government could regulate adventure safety and how that can improve the sector and improve the competitiveness of the Japanese adventure travel and adventure tourism economy. There is some action at the prefectural level in Hokkaido and Nagano, in particular with supporting good standards in adventure safety, but it's still a work in progress in Japan with respect to national adventure safety regulation. There are also a number of other places around the world where there are national or subnational adventure safety regulations. When you put in standards, the question arises, how do we make sure that people are actually meeting those standards? And there are a few different approaches to this. One is for companies to say, okay, we have these standards and I have met them. There's no need for anyone to check me or inspect. That's not super effective. There's another method, which is industry self-regulation, and that's having a third-party system that's run by the private sector with a third-party audit, like Vatkin's system. And so an industry association might have this, or there might be a private accreditation service. And And so that's a little bit more effective, but it's voluntary and it's self-regulation. So there's concerns about is it actually happening as intended. The most effective way, if you want compliance with a set of safety standards, is to require it by the government. And the government has the power to make these requirements in the form of regulation, and the government can create consequences like fines if the regulations aren't followed. So there are a few different ways to do conformance to standards, and having government regulation, because the government can require things, is the most effective if the goal is to have every operator meet a minimum baseline for safety management. In the nearly 40 years that I've been involved in adventure safety, I have seen the adventure and outdoor industry, I have seen expectations for safety increase. And what was done 20 years ago is no longer acceptable today. The adventure tourism sector is also professionalizing. You can get your PhD in outdoor recreation or adventure travel these days. And as many countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia are looking to get a slice of the adventure travel and adventure tourism market, competitiveness is increasing globally. So this increases pressure on countries like Iceland to have a high standard of quality with respect to safety in adventure. And with high quality regulations that support high quality adventure experiences, there are a number of benefits. We work with people around the world, and adventure professionals globally say to us, we want to know what's good practice. We want to know, what does success look like in risk management for adventures? And regulations have the power to provide that clarity. And regulations can also make a fair operating environment for adventure businesses by requiring everybody to meet a minimum standard. So some people don't undercut competitors by failing to follow good safety practices and reducing their costs. And this can help every single adventure operator and can improve the entire adventure travel and tourism sector. Let's talk about some of the things that might go into a safety plan, as Verdemalstofa refers to it, or a safety management system more broadly that regulations can address. So I want to talk about three different things here: human factors, safety by design, and safety culture. When a person commits an error in an adventure activity or anywhere else, it's usually not because of technical deficits like not understanding how to do swiftwater rescue or not understanding during a mountaineering trip how to create a climbing anchor, but the issues are also often due to a deficit in interpersonal skills or cognitive skills. And so training in those interpersonal and cognitive skills may be helpful to reduce human error. And so regulations can reflect that. One of the research pieces about decision making is that it's really hard to find ways to help people to make good decisions in terms of cognitive processes and making good judgments. And so one of the best ways to support good decision making in the adventure sector is to structurally reduce the need for people to make difficult safety decisions like, well, we're climbing this mountain and we really should turn around because it's getting late, but the client wants us to keep going. Maybe we should just continue on, even though safety-wise we should turn back, but we really want the tips. So finding ways like setting procedures to say, okay, we are just not going to drive at night because that's more dangerous than driving during the day. We're going to establish our schedules to reduce night driving as much as is reasonably practicable. And having procedures like established turnaround times and checklists can support good safety judgment. So this can be reflected in regulations. One of the ways to express human factors in incident causation is through looking at human and organizational performance. And rather than saying, okay, this particular adventure guide made a mistake and they are lazy or dumb or just wrong or negligent, we can look at what did the organization do to set this person up for success? How can we make it more difficult for a person to make the wrong decision? And this is where managerial steps like workload and fatigue management, setting a positive safety culture where there's good psychological safety, where people can say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this. I'm not sure this is safe and appropriate. Can we talk about this as an organization? Where there's decision aids that help people make good decisions. These are all administrative steps that help good decisions to be made and reduce the likelihood for error. So safety regulations can encourage positive human and organizational performance. There is a concept called the hierarchy of controls, known in Europe as safety by design. And the idea is that when a person is designing a risk management system, there are more effective ways to do that, such as eliminating risks, and there are less effective ways to support good safety outcomes, such as handing people personal protective equipment. And the more effective outcomes have less residual risk after, or the more effective control measures have less residual risk after those control measures have been applied. And it's important to note that the more effective control measures do not require people to take appropriate action or to make the right decision, such as assembling a climbing anchor appropriately or following a checklist completely. So if we want to have the best safety outcomes, we can pay attention to this hierarchy of safety controls and seek to eliminate risks or substitute something that's high risk for something that's a little bit lower risk. For example, say, okay, we're not going to do ice cave tours in the summer, but we may go sea kayaking instead, which is a lower risk activity in the summer. And then administrative controls are understood to be less effective. And this is things like staff training and standard operating procedures and gear checks and debriefs. These have a role, but we recognize that because this relies on people doing the right thing, these are less effective than elimination and substitution measures. So good adventure safety regulation will require operators to employ the hierarchy of controls. And if we look at the hierarchy of controls from a complex socio-technical systems viewpoint, and adventure activities can be seen as comprising a complex socio-technical system, we recognize that operators can apply this hierarchy of controls for their own activity, but individual associations like SAF or the Association of Icelandic Mountain Guides and government bodies have important roles to play in supporting good safety outcomes. There's an interest in supporting a positive safety culture in adventure activities, and we can consider culture to be the beliefs and values that people hold, which drive behaviors, and safety culture as the beliefs and values around safety that people hold. For example, how safety is prioritized relative to other legitimate competing organizational aims like customer service satisfaction or financial performance. It's very difficult or impossible to regulate what people believe or what people value, but we can regulate behavior. So one way to support a good safety culture through regulation is to require the top leadership of the adventure tourism operator to demonstrate a positive safety culture by having a clear understanding of the operator's activities and the risks arising from those activities, and to ensure that appropriate resources are available and used for managing the risks of those activities. So to summarize these pieces here around thinking about contemporary safety science and how that can be applied to regulatory requirements for a safety management system or a safety plan, we can require training and procedures that are based off of contemporary safety science thoughts and ideas and good practices around reducing human error. We can require the hierarchy of controls to be applied by operators when they're designing their safety system and their activities. We can avoid focusing on control measures that depend on people making the right decision in the moment, in the field, and we can take steps from a regulatory basis to support a positive safety culture. When regulators are considering regulating the adventure or the outdoor sector, questions arise about who do we regulate exactly? What activities should we have fall subject to these regulations? And every jurisdiction can make their own decisions around this. It's common for high-risk activities to be regulated, but lower-risk activities like nature walks not to be regulated. Typically, recreational activities are regulated. There are often loopholes for outdoor education rather than outdoor recreation programs. Often schools are exempted for better, for worse. Government-led adventure activities, military and voluntary-led activities like by a club often are subject to loopholes where they don't fall underneath the regulations. In some places where a maritime authority or a civil aviation authority regulates water-based or air-based activities, then adventure activity regulations may not need to regulate those activities because they're already regulated by some other means. When we think about developing regulations, there are 5 different components to these regulations, and we'll walk through them one by one. In order for a government to regulate adventure activities, it has to have the authority to create and enforce such regulations. Most of the time, this has already been established by a nation's or a jurisdiction's Health and Safety Act, but if not, then a separate law needs to be passed authorizing the government to regulate adventure activities, as was done in Switzerland. Once you have the law, then you create the regulations, the more detailed regulations underneath that law. And there are a number of mechanical pieces to those regulations. So you need to say, for example, who gets regulated, what activities get regulated, which agency does the regulation. It's usually the nation's or the jurisdiction's health and safety agency. What are the safety standards, and what are the mechanics of applying for a license or a permit or a registration and having that suspended? Are there fines for non-compliance, and how much are they? All those mechanical pieces need to be added to the regulation so the logistics of the regulatory system works. The standards then need to be developed, and so there should be very clear expectations around safety requirements, and the best adventure regulatory systems will have a third-party audit so that there is a check to make sure that adventure operators are actually doing what their paperwork says they should be doing. And you've seen this slide before. These are regulations or adventure safety standards in New Zealand, and this could be a good role model for any regulations in the Icelandic adventure, travel, and tourism sector. One other thing that governments can do to support quality and safety in adventure activities is to develop approved codes of practice. And a code of practice is more detailed than regulation. It might say, for example, what the ratio of guides to guests is. It might say this is required equipment for this type of activity, like rafting. It might say a certain type of guide needs these types of certifications or qualifications. These are usually quite detailed documents, and when it's been formally approved by the government, in some jurisdictions like the United Kingdom, this can come with valuable legal protections. Whereas, for example, in the UK, if there is an incident, but an adventure operator has followed the procedures outlined in the approved code of practice, then that adventure operator cannot be found negligent with respect to those activities described in that code of practice. So this is a valuable tool to support clarity about expectations and also provide potential legal protections for adventure operators. It's really important that government do more than just lay out a set of rules in a regulatory framework, but the best outcomes happen when government and the private sector, the adventure industry, work very closely together to think about what should go in the law and the regulation, and that operators and industry associations like SAF collaborate and communicate with the government. And the government can support the private sector in developing training schemes and certification or qualification systems, accreditation systems if necessary, and development of codes of practice, also known as good practice guidelines or activity safety guidelines, written documents to talk about how activities should be conducted. And one important role for government here is to provide funding to the private sector, usually to adventure associations or outdoor or travel industry associations like SAF or like the Association of Icelandic Mountain Guides, for example, to help them have the funding to develop all these assets that will elevate the adventure industry. In thinking about developing regulation, it's important to think about how much time different operators should have to with respect to different types of activities to meet the adventure regulations. You might have 1 year or 3 years or even 5 years from the passing of a regulatory system, a regulation, until it comes into force. When we wrote the regulations, the adventure tourism regulations for the nation of Georgia, we said, okay, we're going to require people to have an IFMGA certification to go mountaineering or a certification from the Georgia Mountain Guides Association, but we're going to give them 5 years to get to that point, because there's a lot of old school guides who had been leading mountaineering trips for years without the certification, and we wanted to give them enough time to get certified. It's also important that government provide funding to the industry so that they can develop good practice guides and other assets and structures. And there's not a need to reinvent the wheel. There are a number of existing standards that are out there that can be applied, like EN 15567 for ropes courses and zip lines, that probably doesn't need much of any changes to be adopted in Iceland if it isn't already. IFMGA is international standard for mountaineering, and the health directorate has already well-established protocols for wilderness medicine that can be adopted. There are lots of different ways to doing this, so every jurisdiction gets to figure out what's best for them. And in some places, like in New Zealand, the government found that it was useful to hire consultants or experts to work individually with particularly smaller and newer adventure operators to help them develop their safety management systems between the time the regulation was passed and when it came into force, so that they were able to overcome the burden of improving their systems and their structures. How do private operators see regulation? Well, in the work that we have done with adventure tourism professionals around the world, we found that people want clarity about what's expected of them. They want to know, what does good safety management look like? And well-created regulations can help provide that answer to them. They also want a fair business operating environment, and in many places, they're concerned about poor quality regulation or corrupt enforcement of regulations. And these are legitimate concerns in many places, but I think Iceland has a high-functioning government and should do well there. In places where regulations have been in place for a number of years, like New Zealand and Switzerland and the UK, most operators seem to be happy with those regulations. And in fact, many of them are proud. They say, hey, we are excellent here. We are doing really well. We have high standards and we're meeting those standards. And they're proud of the quality and the safety of their adventure travel experiences that they offer. Not every country is ready to develop and enforce adventure safety regulations. The countries where this is most likely to be effective are places where the government is relatively stable, and when a new ruling party comes into force, there's not a radical change in governmental policy. In places where a country has well-established industry associations that can communicate with the government and advocate for adventure operators, and when the government is high functioning overall. My sense is that Iceland is well positioned to be in a place to develop high quality adventure safety regulations and to enforce those regulations fairly and appropriately. So there's a lot to celebrate around what Iceland does with respect to adventure activities and safety in those activities. There is an opportunity to create high quality regulations which will further elevate the quality and the safety of adventure activities in Iceland. Those regulations should be comprehensive, should be based on the current science around risk management and around quality in adventure activities. They should have a third-party audit system to help ensure that there is good conformance to those regulations. And it's important that the government couple those regulatory requirements with financial support to the industry to help the industry develop the training systems and the good practice guidelines and the other assets they will need in order to meet the new safety requirements. And when that happens in Iceland, then Iceland is very well positioned to continue to be globally recognized as a very competitive and desirable and attractive destination for adventure tourism and adventure travel. If you'd like more information or to download a copy of this presentation, which came at you fairly quickly, I recognize you can access that all at verstar.com/post/SAF through that link, and that QR code will get you there as well. So I want to say thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Engin með athugasemdir eða spurningar?
Góðan daginn, aðallega heiti ég, hi. So,
Enska tack.
Yeah. I just accidentally introduced myself in Icelandic, but yeah. So, I was just wondering. I come from Megasamfland, but also know a lot of other activities in Iceland. But I feel like that the people that are in this meeting and the people that are, doing well, are usually like going by all the rules and doing more than it's expected and everything. But it is these like 1% that are not taking safety measures. So it's I would like to have some suggestions on how we can make it without punishing us that are doing great, that it's not costly and too much to go through, so that's my experience, or my feeling, that we want rules but not maybe for the guys that are not doing well or not taking safety measures.
Right.
Any comments on that?
Well, let me share some ideas, then you can tell me if I'm understanding your comment appropriately. Regulations apply to everybody who's going to be doing things, and I think the bigger operators either are doing things correctly or have the financial and the staff resources to do things correctly. Like Arctic Adventures can do whatever it wants with respect to safety. It's very, very well resourced and very experienced, but a smaller, newer operator may struggle. And so this is where associations like SAF can be really important because they can say, hey, we're going to have meetings, we're going to have discussions, we're going to support you, we're going to develop good practice guidelines or codes of practice with you, we're going to provide trainings, and maybe there's subsidies or scholarships for trainings. The government can say, here are these regulations, but there's a 2-year period before they come into force. So, and we're going to provide financial resources to help the smaller providers that really need the support to upskill themselves and to develop their procedures and their systems. So I think lots of time, lots of communication, lots of listening, and lots of meetings are going to be helpful to this. In Australia, when this process went through of developing adventure safety standards, the adventure industry spent years sitting in meetings thinking about this, and the government paid for coffee and donuts for years for private sector to come together in these meetings and talk about, okay, what should be the adventure safety standards that apply here in Australia. And when adventure regulations went into place in the UK, a number of operators who are marginal said, that's it, we're just going to go out of business. We were barely making any money. We had a restaurant by the water and we had a few kayaks, and we're just going to focus on the restaurant. And that may be okay. There are some people that are going to say, I'm just not interested in all this extra work and I'm going to go off and do other things. So there were a few companies that stopped operating in the UK in the 1990s, but then the sector rebounded. And people came in and said, okay, I'm going to start a business. I'm excited to offer adventure activities. Here are these regulations, and we're going to meet them. So lots of listening, lots of paying attention, lots of dialogue, time and money. I think all those pieces can be helpful to ensure that the smaller operators who really, really need support and help are empowered to meet the requirements. Does that adequately respond to your comment?
Yes, but in my experience as well, it's not just the smaller companies that, it's also some of the bigger companies. I'm not naming names, but some of them are not taking safety, to the extreme, like what we would like to, So that is and actually often they are not in the conversation, these guys. And they're not attending these meetings. So that's what I'm, how can we get them to understand the importance and attend these meetings and, force them, or I don't know. Yeah, but thank you. It's really important, and thank you for your lecture. It was many great things in there.
Tack för er. And I think it is a challenge, and some people will never be happy about it, and some people will advocate against regulations. But I think in Iceland, there's sufficient. The economics are sufficient to support high quality safety regulations. And the good thing about regulations is once they're passed, they apply to everybody that's described in the regulations. And so lots of outreach, lots of knocking on doors saying, please come to this meeting and let's talk about things. We want to hear your voice. We are the association that represents the travel and tourism industry. We want to learn, what are your concerns? What are you looking for? And recognize that not everyone's going to be happy. Not everyone's going to pay attention. But at least you've given them the opportunity. And in Iceland, things are so small compared to, say, India or China, that you have it easier than some other countries with respect to this sort of thing. Thanks for your thought.
Fleiri spurningar? Allir bara 100% sáttir bara og þetta leiðin, eða engin með komment? All right, Jeff, I think we have all the questions for now. Thank you for the presentation and explanations. We'll probably get the presentation from Jeff and share it with you with some links and so on. Other than that, I'd just like to use the opportunity to thank you again.
Well, takk fyrir. It's a real pleasure to meet you all and to speak with you. And I think so very highly of what Iceland is doing with respect to adventure activities, and really pleased to support you in continuing to do such wonderful work that you do. So best wishes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Ég var að taka 5 mínúta kaffipásu. Standa þessu upp og tegja okkur eitthvað.